Okay, thank you very much for coming along tonight. I think that was a really remarkable film, and there'll be lots to talk about. I found it very moving. That was the first time I'd seen it. My name is Emma Batha. I'm a journalist with Thomson Reuters Foundation, and I'm going to moderate this panel. I've been writing about statelessness for about 8 or 9 years now with an international team I work with. So tonight, to discuss some of the themes of the film, we have Melanie Khanna, Chief of the Statelessness section at the UNHCR, and we have Anuradha Mookerjee, and she's a research fellow here at the Institute in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology. So we're going to spend about 10 minutes having a discussion up here, and then we want to turn it over to you. And please ask questions of either of the panelists, or if you want to ask me, that's fine too. So, Melanie, if we can start with you. How did you feel watching that film?
Oof.
Yes, exactly.
What a question to start with. You almost need to take a moment, right, or more than a moment. It's obviously a super emotional movie. I think I felt probably like everybody here did, bowled over, almost from the beginning. And this is the second time I've seen it, but it shocks you, it grabs you right away with Zain and those boys smoking and then running around the streets with those guns that look, quite real, and you think. And then it just goes on from there, right? The shocks keep coming. And of course, all those, heart-rending twists and turns. But I'm also, I'm in awe of the brilliance of the film. One thing I felt watching it the second time was, wow, the structure of it. Is genius, and the audaciousness of it, right? To cover all of these human stories as brilliantly as it does, with largely people who are not professional actors. I don't know if everybody knows that, but Zain, in real life, as you saw at the end, his real name is Zain. He was a Syrian refugee boy living a hard-scrabble life in Beirut when the film director found him. So that adds another dimension, right? As you're watching it, you know that many of these people are, again, not professional actors. The scenes of women in detention are based on real detention centers in Lebanon. So admiration for the brilliance of the film, for the performances. Again, knowing these people are not professional actors just adds to the sort of, unbelievableness of the performance. So lots of emotions, but I was also very interested, from a kind of intellectual standpoint, because we don't see movies very often that depict the situation of people who are living without documents, or in the case of Zain, also living without citizenship, and we can get into, why.
We'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah. But so for me, it was just fascinating, how is this filmmaker going to show the human impact of that? And it did it so well, right? Because documentation issues often sound kind of boring. If you have to explain to people why is civil registration important, that sounds like a boring conversation. But when you find out his sister dies on the door of the hospital because she didn't have documents. So anyway, enough in really answer to your first question, but it really exactly drives it home. And I'm just super impressed by this movie in so many ways.
Yeah. Was it the first time you'd seen the movie?
No, the second time.
Yeah. And what did you take away from it?
Well, the movie really makes you quiet for a while, and it helps us think very deeply. It is a very powerful portrayal of the specific nature of precariousness that is associated with childhood statelessness and with stateless people in general. I think it does a great job at giving visibility as well as voice to a stateless child, and specifically, I would highlight two things. One is, for example, the protagonist Zain, when he's taking care of Jonas, and the kind of protection that he's bringing to him. So I think that speaks very highly about his claiming the right to protection as a human right of a child. And then when, for example, he's suing his parents, I mean, I see that as his self-questioning, and in his self-questioning, he's also claiming his human freedom. And here, I mean, I would go back to Hannah Arendt, and, I would think that she, reading of Augustin, one of the philosophers she read a lot, and she mentioned that, in becoming human, we are able to question our own beings. So I think that is something which comes out very well in the film. The other thing which I think overall as a theme for the film is the powerlessness that is associated with stateless children and people in general.
Yeah, I think it exposed the vulnerabilities really well.
And the kind of power that we see in the film is very Foucauldian, as I would read it. And I think the power that we see in the film, the power of the state, of course, here, because their main challenge comes from not having a national identity. So the power in the film is very Foucauldian, and it is like it's diffused and not concentrated. It is embodied and enacted and not possessed. And it is constituted as agents, and it's not deployed. So it is not necessarily the police or the law enforcement who represent power. Power here is represented by the likes of Assad or Espro, or for that matter, Assad's father, who is controlling the water pipes, which is leading to that huge the flood in the bathroom. So, all kinds of people who have the legal rights, and then they are able to cause so much grief and control over people who do not have those national identity documents. So that, I think, is very well depicted in the film. The other thing that I see in the film is the tension between the social and the legal. And here by social, what I mean is the realm where everyday life happens as it is, irrespective of whether it is legal or not. I mean, people have to live, and they have to resort to all kinds of practices, and they have to mitigate their everyday lives, and that is the realm of the social. And the legal, which is supposed to be legitimate, but as we see in the realm of the social here, it may not really be legitimate, but the legal and the legitimate are at loggerheads and maybe in complete opposition to one another, and which is why we have these questions of human rights that can be seen in the film. Also, I think the film is very timely because, stateless children are constantly born every year, and they add to the number of stateless people in the world. So it is very timely, and new forms of statelessness is emerging, while of course I understand some forms of statelessness are being reduced. But overall, I think it is very educative for the global public to see what exactly the suffering and the grief and the precarity is entailed in a person not having a national identity document. So it boils down to that.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think at that point I'll turn back to Melanie and ask, how do the themes overlap with your work?
Thanks. So you mentioned I work on statelessness for UNHCR, and we do have this 10-year campaign to end statelessness. I don't know if everybody's heard of it. It's known popularly as the I Belong campaign. Gillian mentioned it at the beginning. And it's a kind of, it's a bold move, because UNHCR generally doesn't try to end the problems we work on. I mean, of course, we'd love it if the refugee issue wasn't so overwhelming, if there weren't so many internally displaced people, but we're not actively, running campaigns to try to end those things. Statelessness is different because it's fully solvable. So statelessness is the condition of people who have no nationality. I don't know if everybody here has even heard of statelessness before. It's a kind of counterintuitive problem, right? Because everybody has parents, everybody's born somewhere, so you would think that everybody would have a nationality, but As Gillian mentioned in her opening, there are actually millions of people around the world who are not recognized as citizens by any state. And that can happen in a number of ways. It can happen because people fall through the cracks, their births aren't registered. It can happen when, and that can leave them without proof of their entitlement to citizenship and put them at risk of statelessness and potentially make them ultimately stateless. It can happen when states break up or succeed from each other, like when the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. A whole bunch of new states came into existence and passed their own nationality laws, and not everybody who was on the territory qualified for citizenship. And it may, take years or decades before that kind of thing gets sorted out. It also happens because of explicit forms of discrimination in nationality laws. So, for example, in Myanmar, if you are from the Rohingya ethnic group, you are not qualified to be a citizen at birth. In 1982, Myanmar basically amended its nationality law to remove the Rohingya from the list of ethnic groups that are qualified to be citizens at birth. There are also 25 states globally that don't let mothers confer citizenship on their children on an equal basis as fathers. There is also a lot of de facto discrimination, even where discrimination is not written into the nationality law. Discrimination at the level of the civil registrar, who refuses to issue documents to people who don't look like the dominant group or don't speak the language of the dominant group, can lead to statelessness. So these kinds of things are fully solvable. It's a matter of the right approach in nationality laws that basically have an absence of bad things that don't contain discrimination, and have the presence of good things, which is certain safeguards against statelessness. So, for example, entitling every child born on the territory who would otherwise be stateless to acquire the nationality where he or she is born. So this is all a long-winded way of saying these are the things that I work on at UNHCR. We basically advocate with governments for the absence of bad things in their nationality laws that can leave people stateless, and the presence of good things, of certain safeguards. We also are starting to do more work on civil registration laws. There are a lot of civil registration laws that also contain discrimination. Many countries don't allow children's births to be registered unless a marriage certificate is presented, for example. Many countries don't allow a mother by herself to register a child. It needs to be a mother and a father, often a mother, a father, and a marriage certificate. So civil registry laws can also be problematic, and it's something we also do advocacy work on. And just getting birth registration rates up globally is incredibly important. Everybody has the right to have their birth registered according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and yet birth registration rates around the world remain alarmingly low in countries outside of the developed world. So those are some of the things we are working on at UNHCR.
Thank you very much. And Anuradha, I'm a little less familiar with your work. Can you explain how that overlaps with your work and your research?
Well, I'm an anthropologist, so I recently concluded for my PhD degree an ethnography on the India-Bangladesh border enclaves. I do not work on de jure form of statelessness, but on the populations which I have worked on. They have encountered something between de facto and de jure form of statelessness. So here, and I mean, in the
Sorry
film,
to interrupt, just in case people don't understand, could you just explain de jure and
yeah,
de
so
facto
I mean,
for
I
the
think
audience?
in the de jure form of statelessness, one understands that the person does not have a nationality. And in the de facto is like the refugee who, who has the nationality, but then, has been out of the country and does not have the rights, and is somebody who is persecuted or outside the influence of the state. So in my case, what I found was for the population I worked on, they have historically, I mean, these are enclaves, an enclave meaning the territory of one state, which is surrounded on all sides by the territory of another state. And here, of course, in the film, we saw an urban context in Lebanon, and I'm taking you 5,000 kilometers away to the India-Bangladesh border, which is an extremely rural countryside. But, of course, it is full of surveillance, and there is a huge presence of the Indian security state. So here in those little enclaves, which were people between the period of 1947, that's the time for decolonization of British India, and the creation of the nation states of India and Pakistan, and later Bangladesh was formed in 1971. So between the period of 1947 and 2015, July of 2015, people lived in these enclaves where they were unenumerated. They did not have any nationality documents. The state was not present in their territories. And of course, I mean, for everyday life, they had no other way but to take help of the host state, which is for the Bangladeshi enclaves. They had to come to India for their livelihoods and for their education and health and for all other purposes. So here, the person who was from the Bangladeshi enclave was then labeled as a foreigner or an illegal immigrant in India, because of course that person did not have any document. But in a similar trope of powerlessness, which was experienced by these people, so they experienced powerlessness on two ways. One was, the powerlessness because of their religion. So the Muslims of the enclaves, they were the ones who were picked up by the border security force or the law enforcement, but the Hindus of the enclaves, they were treated as proxy citizens of India. So this is something similar to what you say about the intersection between statelessness and about ethnicity, religion, or other factors. So that's something similar. And the other way in which powerlessness existed for these people was the uneven exchange of value, so of economic value. So, whatever they earned was way lesser than what an Indian labor would earn. So because they were treated as illegals, so of course they were their wage prices were depressed. So that caused much marginality and poverty among them. And however, the positive part, similar to the film that we see here, is the agency of these people who, over the period of 7 decades, they resisted their state of not having a national identity document and of de facto statelessness, and they engaged in a community movement. So that, I think, is very positive.
Thank you. And now we're going to open it up to the floor. Is there somebody with a microphone? Or can we, there is, great. Sorry, I can't see very well because of all the bright lights. Can you just raise your hand? There's somebody at the back and somebody down here, if that's okay. We'll take 2 questions and then, thank you.
I have one observation and then one question.
Okay.
And the observation is that we're talking about these problems of statelessness as though they're only in third world countries or places where people of color live. But I know that as recently as 40, 50 years ago, Swiss people did not pass along their citizenship if they were female. And my question is, what has happened to the concept of Nansen passports? Or Nansen documents?
Okay, I think that's probably one for you, Melanie, in a minute, but should we just take the one up at the top? Yes, thank you.
Hi. First, thank you so much for this event and for being here. I'm Lebanese, and I used to live in Lebanon. And my question is actually to all of you. There's quite a separation between different social classes in Lebanon. We live in a certain way, and honestly, this is the first time I've seen this movie, and I've seen things in Lebanon that I haven't seen before. And my question is, how do we kind of get civil society to be more involved in people who come from different classes and trying to show, especially Syrian refugees, which is a kind of a big issue in Lebanon, having children everywhere who don't have a home. We feel empathy for them, but there isn't enough civil action. So how would you, or what is your recommendation or advice to kind of motivate more people to be involved in helping kind of people who are homeless or who really need help, and not just to be numb to it? So thank you.
Okay. Melanie, do you want to start with the first question, and if you can address the second question as well, and then we'll
Sure.
pass over to
Really excellent point about statelessness not being limited to, the world outside, Western Europe, other well-developed states. Not at all. In fact, statelessness exists on every populated continent and every part of the world. There are stateless people still in Switzerland. And your point about gender discrimination is right on point as well. It's only in 1979 that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women gets adopted. Switzerland was relatively late, in making its nationality law gender equal only even after, CEDAW was adopted. But if we go back not very far in time at all to before CEDAW, the majority of countries in Western Europe, for example, had gender discrimination in their nationality laws, and they spread that through their colonies. A lot of the gender discrimination that we still see in nationality laws today is a hangover of Western colonialism. So it's an interesting topic. And maybe just quickly on the other question, good question. How do we raise awareness and get civil society groups more involved? That is absolutely part of what we need to be doing, and that's part of why we wanted to show this film here tonight. Part of our job is to raise awareness about statelessness and related issues. As Gillian said, bring this issue out of the shadows. So I'm really pleased if it was awareness raising for you. Check out the hashtag #IBelong campaign. There are some specific things you can do to get involved. But I also welcome ideas from others about how civil society groups can get more involved.
Yes, just to answer your question, I'm not a lawyer or a politician, but this is what the media tries to do all the time, put a human face on these issues. And I try to do in print what she did visually. We're always looking for the compelling stories that will motivate the public and politicians to take action. And just on your point, I wanted to say that I'm based in London, and most of our reporting on statelessness is done in regions around the world, but actually I've met many stateless people in Britain. There are stateless people in every Western European country, I assume Eastern European as well. So it really is universal.
I think I would just want to respond to the question of civil society movement, and I think that there is a lot of transnational civil societies which are currently existing, and they are working on these issues of statelessness. And specifically, I think the diasporas of many countries of stateless people, they are very active, and so I think it would be great for people who are interested in the issues to also join hands with them. Yes.
Okay, have we got any more questions? The gentleman down there.
Hi, also Lebanese, hello. I have a question and more of a comment, quick comment than a question. So I remember seeing this movie in Beirut, and my experience going to see the film, as I think the experience of other Lebanese people as well, is on the way to the theater, you encountered stateless people on the streets, because that's just how it is, whether they're selling gum or begging for money. And I think after seeing the film was good, because in one way it humanizes stateless people in the country, because they're dehumanized to a large extent. So there's, I think, good that comes out with the film. But I think one point that's problematic, and that's not problematic, but Zain, when he's in the prison and doing the call and in court, the question of blame, it's put on the parents. Why was I born into, or why did they give birth to me? And I think that kind of resonates with a dominant narrative in Lebanon, and I'm sure other stateless countries, where the blame for statelessness or for the condition or for putting kids into or for the conditions that they live in is put on the parents, on working class people, on stateless people, and not necessarily towards the state, which perhaps doesn't provide social services. Even for Triggs' case, like the reason she's in that situation is because of a racist foreign worker law that borders on modern slavery. And I'm wondering, do you recognize that problematic aspect of the movie? Do we see this in discussions on statelessness around the world? Does it even matter where we put the blame? Because I just worry that while we humanize stateless people, we also blame them. And we do this subconsciously, we don't think about it, but then, oh, like, don't have any more kids if you can't afford it. Well, no, like, it's a state's fault. Like, you should be able to go to a hospital, even if you don't have papers, you should be able to do. So I'm wondering if this is part of the discussion at all. Does it affect the topic?
Do you want to pick up on any of that?
Sure. I mean, I actually think the movie does quite a good job at, problematizing the way you feel about Zain's parents, right? I mean, you want to throttle them, but you have some sympathy for them too. And I think it does depict statelessness as an intergenerational issue that is absolutely related to issues of poverty, discrimination, fear of the authorities, illiteracy, inability to work in the formal sector because you don't have documents, maybe inability to get a marriage certificate, because if you don't have identity documents, you can't get that marriage certificate, you can't get that birth certificate. So I thought it did, kind of a good job of showing these things as a bit interrelated in a vicious cycle kind of way, including intergenerationally. But I also think the state is accountable for its laws and policies, and Gillian mentioned it briefly, and I don't want to single out Lebanon because, this is one movie that happens to be set in Lebanon, but it does so happen to be the case that in Lebanon, mothers cannot confer nationality on their children on an equal basis with men. Registering a child's birth is something that is meant to happen in the first year of birth, and if it doesn't, it gets quite onerous. It's very difficult. Her reference to you have to go to a court, basically you have to go to a judge if you don't get a birth certificate in the first year of a child's birth. And although in principle every child born in Lebanon to a Lebanese father is entitled to Lebanese citizenship, in practice you don't acquire the citizenship until you get inscribed on your father's personal status document. If you're not inscribed on your father's personal status document, you won't be recognized in practice as Lebanese. And so I think that's all sort of, packed in there, and good that we unpack it. But it, it is a tangled web with many, again, kind of vicious circle sort of consequences and causes, which is what we found, just by the way, again, on my point about not singling out Lebanon, when we went to 9 countries a few years ago and did some qualitative research on stateless kids and their families, we found this same kind of vicious cycle. Parents who didn't work legally couldn't afford to send their kids to school. The school would not admit them without papers unless they paid something. So lots of stuff like that. And when we did a more recent report on stateless minorities, we found that these issues of discrimination, fear of the authorities, inability, again, to go to school, to work legally, again, all kind of bound up with each other for groups like the Roma in Europe, among others.
And I imagine child marriage and early marriage is quite common among stateless populations.
Absolutely,
yeah. Is there anything you wanted to add to that? Have you?
Well, I would agree with the point that you make, that yes, the film is a bit optimistic about the state system, and I think that is a creative license, and also because it does want to advocate with the states, because finally it shows that the state does give the national identity. So that is very remarkable. So I would consider the film also having its role as for advocacy. But in general, of course, I mean, statelessness is the responsibility for the states to address both in terms of how they look into policies of people's mobility and migration, and also about how they look into their own composition of their nations in terms of, you know, a plurality of race, religion, and ethnicity. So yes, this does have a more positive bias towards the state and looks upon the state as the, somebody who can solve, because only states can solve the problem of statelessness. So I think we have to have the hope for them.
Yeah, that's very true. Is there anyone else? The gentleman there.
Thank you. This is the second time I see this film. I'm also from Lebanon. And I must say that although I'm pleased that we're talking about statelessness because it's such an important matter, the first time I saw the film, that was really secondary. It's the poverty, the inability of the state, or in this case of Lebanon, to deal with issues where people don't have electricity, they don't have running water, not because they're stateless, but because they live in Lebanon. And you know, we just had 10 days of demonstrations, not about statelessness or statefulness, and the discrimination against people because of their religion or their color takes place in Europe, in the United States. Even people who have, Mexicans who come to the United States are not stateless, but they're discriminated just as much as these people in Lebanon. So what I want to say is the first time I saw the film, I thought of only the poverty and the inequality. And today you brought up the other theme. But I think that is a secondary theme in this film. And to talk about statelessness is all that basically is what you've been doing, which I thank you for. But it also takes away the main issue of what's going on in that country and other countries like it. Thank you.
Okay, I'll come to you in a minute on that. Is there anyone else? We'll do 2 questions. Okay, over there.
Hi, thank you. So I have a question for Miss Melanie. I did work with ethnic minorities that are also stateless, specifically, as you mentioned, the Roma. And while in the Balkan region, and while there are some programs that opt for, they ask for them to sign up, like public calls, so bring in all of your documents or bring in some notarized statement that explains when you were born. Most of them don't have the knowledge, or they don't know the procedure. So what are some reforms that can be done for this process to be eased up? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Melanie, I don't know if you want to address the first point about it not being about poverty more than statelessness.
I mean, I who can disagree with that, right?
Exactly.
Poverty is definitely a dominant theme here. I think, in fact, when my team first suggested this movie, you know, I watched it and I was sort of like, really? We don't, you don't explicitly get statelessness talked about. But, then I was convinced that it is in there, as a theme. But so is, poverty for sure, lack of access to documentation, whether it makes you stateless or not, is also a big theme, right? Because the Ethiopian migrant or refugee, it's not clear which she is not necessarily stateless, but documentation is a big issue. Human trafficking is in there as a theme, right? There are all kinds of themes. And again, I think these themes are, in life, very often interrelated and bound up with each other. So I wouldn't want to take away from the importance of poverty as a theme or as a real factor and, problem that often can lead to people being stateless who might not otherwise become stateless.
But it's really rare to see this issue brought out, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think that's why we're you were keen to.
Exactly. We don't have many movies that do talk about statelessness explicitly.
And it is an issue that's very hard to put a human face on, so she's done a tremendous job of showing what lack of documentation does.
As Emma does, by the way, in her work. Do check out Emma Batha if you want to learn more about statelessness and read more stories about human impact, because I'm really glad you said that that's something that you as a journalist work on doing.
Yeah, and it is a struggle, so I think she did an amazing job.
Good job.
But yes, I wouldn't either take away from the fact if I'd seen it sort of at home, not here, I'd have thought, yes, it was about poverty first and foremost. Do you want to address the second one?
I mean, thank you for raising the Roma and your personal experience working with them. It's one of the most difficult issue areas for us when we're working with European countries, and there, absolutely, you see again this, vicious cycle. Where people are afraid of the authorities, so they may not even register their own children's, births, even though they are in principle entitled to register their children wherever they're born, whether they're legal residents or not. People who work outside of the formal, sector. Education is even more challenging for people who are leading nomadic lifestyles, which many, Roma people do. I mean, again, we basically advocate for governments to give everybody a protected status, whether they recognize them as citizens or legal residents. If they think they're stateless and assess the statelessness correctly, they should give them a statelessness status and the protection that comes with that, allow them to go to school, allow them to graduate with a certificate, allow them to work legally. So we basically, again, advocate with governments for, changes in civil registration practice and laws and changes to nationality laws that will get rid of the statelessness, but also a protected status for people who are stateless.
Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything? I think they were more directed at Melanie, but if there's anything you wanted to add to...
Well, I mean, the only point I can add here is that, poverty is very much connected to illegality. So when a person does not have a legal status, then obviously the gray market is much big, and that includes the gray labor market. So I think illegality and poverty kind of go hand in hand and only increases.
Vulnerabilities. I saw there was one other person who wanted to ask a question. I think we're going to wrap up now. Should we take two more? So one over there. Is there anybody else who wants to ask? On the way up. Yes, I've got her. Is there anybody else? Great. Okay. Thank you.
So I was not sure if I should ask this because it's not exactly the direction of the debate, but I'd like to know how you understand the name of the movie. Capharnaüm, as far as I know, is the place in Lake Tiberias where Jesus walked on water. I don't know if there is some metaphor or perhaps it's also a name of a place in Lebanon I'm not aware about.
Okay, and can we take the lady up there?
So thank you very much. My question is a bit of a follow-up on the question on how to speed up and ease up the process to legalize and to give nationality to some groups such as the Roma. Mrs. Melanie, you mentioned that one of the reasons why some group don't have a nationality may be because of some discriminatory laws that are in the States. And so, differently from the Roma question, in this case, it's not a matter of procedures, but it's a matter of a will of the state to do this, right? So I was wondering, when you are in this situation, working for the UN, how do you advocate to change the law? What are the strategy, the tools?
Okay, thank you very much. Melanie, again.
Would Anuradha like to take the question about the title? Because I have no idea. Other than that, it means chaos in French.
I think that is homework we have.
Yeah.
Look into
We
the
think it means
title. I missed
chaos.
mine.
It does mean, I mean, the French
Yes.
use it as a word for chaos. I guess it's something, I don't know where it comes from, but I've heard it used in French to mean chaos. But I don't know anything about the, potential other layers of reference, which may be there.
Does anyone else in the audience know? Oh, hell. Okay, thank you. And on the second question,
Advocacy. I mean, I appreciate it. It's a constant sort of process of coming up with new tools in the toolbox, right, to try to convince states. So, when I first started working on statelessness, the rhetoric that we used was typically the rhetoric of human rights and pointing to the obligations that states have in different human rights treaties, combined with some of the human impact stuff, right? So storytelling, and then also, as we've become more sophisticated, evidence-based arguments. So doing studies on the population on a state's territory to prove to a state that there are actually real people on the state who don't have a nationality, and here are their real issues, combined with some human impact, high impact kind of storytelling. But then also as time has gone on and the Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted, we've more and more been using kind of the, if you like, the rhetoric of development and the language of development to try to make the case to states that, they all signed up to leave no one behind, right? That's the sort of overarching principle of the Sustainable Development Agenda, and stateless people are at risk of being left behind. And then there are specific Sustainable Development Goals that are highly relevant, like SDG 16.9 is legal identity for all, including birth registration, by 2030. And SDG 5 is eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere. So I would say these days it's a combination of kind of the language of human rights and the language of development, finding hooks in things that states have already signed up to, and making arguments that appeal to their own interests in being more developed and being seen to be more developed. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but those are the kinds of things we usually are working on and thinking about.
Anuradha, I know you don't work in advocacy, but is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Not really.
No.
I think that pretty much summarizes.
Yes. One thing I've noticed just in my own work is I've interviewed quite a lot of stateless people, and just the tremendous waste of talent and human resource. I've interviewed actually this year a heart surgeon who was stateless. It's a complicated story. He unusually did get an education, very bright, and he ended up detained in Bulgaria. No paperwork, can't practice, and yet he's a heart surgeon. He's got all these skills that countries ought to be reaching out for. He's an exception, but even, just about everybody I've interviewed has they're articulate, they've got such spirit and drive, and they just can't start to build a future for themselves.
Yeah, I should have said that. That's sort of related to making the evidence-based cases.
Yes.
Finding these people and getting them to act as spokespeople is another thing we do, because we do have some stateless and formerly stateless people who are incredibly articulate at telling their own story and convincing their governments that they exist, but also convincing their governments that it is a massive waste of potential not to give these people the opportunities that they so clearly deserve.
I'm going to finish it here. I'll just ask Anuradha if she wants to add anything at all about your work or
Well, not about my work so much, but I think since we are at the Institute and there is a lot of research that goes on various issues, not exactly on statelessness, but around statelessness and related to development. So I think, of course, research on statelessness is something which is happening a lot. I mean, there is quite a significant research happening, and also in comparative contexts that I'm aware. And I think that can help bring out what are the barriers to resolving statelessness, and those can also be good additions to the toolbox that Melanie just spoke about, and enrich it in taking forward the goals that they're pursuing through the multilateral system.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add anything?
No,
that's it.
just
Okay.
thank you, Emma, for moderating.
Thank you very much for coming along and for joining in the discussion.